After 10 years in exile, she returned to the Duke's ball, and he said, "I never stopped loving you." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's go back to our main characters. It has been a decade since Isabella Hartley's life was torn apart. 10 long years away from the world she once knew. Exiled and forgotten by those who once held her dear, Isabella had learned to live with the ghosts of her past. She had been forced to leave everything behind, the love of her life, the family she had once called her own, and the future she had dreamed of. All for the sake of a secret, a betrayal she couldn't even fully comprehend. But now she was back. Isabella stood at the grand entrance of Duke William Hawthorne's ball, the same man who had once promised her the world before he had abandoned her. She wasn't the same girl who had once dreamed of a life by his side, but still, the weight of the past pressed on her chest. She had spent the years in exile learning, surviving, and now she had returned to face the man who had haunted her every night. The ball was in full swing, the laughter of the aristocracy filling the air as the orchestra played a tune of old. But the moment she stepped through the door, everything seemed to freeze. Eyes turned, whispers filled the air, and for a split second, she was back in the world she had left behind. And then, their eyes met. Across the room, Duke William stood frozen, his gaze locking with hers. It had been 10 years, but the recognition was instant. The same stormy blue eyes that had once looked at her with love now held a mixture of surprise, shock, and something deeper. Something that Isabella couldn't quite place. She had been prepared for the stares, the judgment, but nothing could prepare her for the rush of emotions that surged within her as she saw him again. William Hawthorne, the Duke of Hawthorne, the man who had once been everything to her, was now standing across the room, a stranger, but also someone she had never truly forgotten. The room seemed to close in around her, but she forced herself to take a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come here for answers, for closure, not for a reunion. But it seemed fate had other plans. As she moved through the crowd, the whispers grew louder, and she could feel his gaze following her every step. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The time for hiding was over. She had to face him. She had to know what had happened, why he had let her go, why he had let them both suffer for so long. And then he was there, standing before her, his tall figure imposing, yet there was a softness in his eyes she hadn't expected. "Isabella," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I never stopped loving you." The words were like a balm to the wounds that had festered for years. They were simple words, but they carried the weight of a decade's worth of pain, regret, and longing. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she searched his eyes, looking for the truth behind them. Was this real? Had he truly never stopped loving her? The years of silence, the distance, the betrayal, all of it flooded back, but she didn't know what to say. How could she? The past was too complicated, too broken. But as she stood there, looking at the man she had once loved, she realized something. The years apart hadn't changed the fact that they were still connected, still bound by something stronger than time, stronger than distance. She took a step closer, her heart racing, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt the possibility of something more than pain between them. Isabella stood there, staring at Duke William, his words hanging in the air like a fragile thread between them. "I never stopped loving you," he had said, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. The grand ballroom, the murmurs of the guests, the sparkling chandeliers above, all of it faded away as her heart raced, her mind trying to make sense of the words she had just heard. 10 years. 10 long years of pain, of exile, of trying to forget the man who had once meant everything to her. And now, here he was, standing before her, with those words. But what did they truly mean? How could they mean anything after all that had happened? Her hand trembled slightly as she clutched her fan, but she forced herself to breathe. She had to think. She had to respond. "You." Her voice faltered, the weight of the years catching in her throat. "You never stopped loving me?" The question sounded almost absurd in her own ears, yet it was all she could manage. William looked at her, his stormy blue eyes darkening with a mix of regret and longing. "Isabella," he began, his voice low and steady. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to let you go. But you were taken from me. My hands were tied, and He trailed off, his expression softening as if he were seeing her for the first time in years. Isabella swallowed hard, her heart aching as memories she had long buried rushed to the surface. She remembered the days before everything changed, how they had been so in love, so certain that nothing could tear them apart. But then, the scandal, the betrayal, her exile. "You let me go," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You chose duty over me, over us." William winced as if her words had struck him physically. "I never wanted to. I swear it. But my father, he forced my hand. And when you were taken away, I had no choice but to follow orders. You have to believe me, Isabella." The pain in his voice was raw, genuine. But how could she believe him now? How could she forget the years of heartache, the isolation, the fear that she had been forgotten? She had built a life in exile, learned to survive, learned to live without him. And yet, standing here now, she felt the flicker of the old emotions she had tried so hard to bury. "And what do you expect from me now?" Isabella asked, her voice barely a whisper. 10 years, William. 10 years of my life that I'll never get back. I've moved on. I had to." The words were like daggers, but she had to say them. She couldn't let him think that everything could just go back to how it was. He couldn't just waltz in and undo all the hurt, all the pain. William reached out, his hand hovering in the air, as if unsure whether to touch her. "Isabella," he said softly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I can never undo the damage I caused. But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped wanting you. And if you'll give me the chance, I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." She shook her head, the tears she had held back for so long threatening to spill over. "I don't know if I can believe that. I don't know if I can trust you again." The words felt like a betrayal to herself, but it was the truth. She had built walls around her heart, walls that had kept her safe all these years. And now, William Hawthorne was standing here, asking her to tear them down. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, give me a chance. I know I've hurt you, but I can't let you go again. I've waited 10 years for this moment, Isabella. Don't make me wait any longer." His plea was desperate, but it was too much. Too soon. She closed her eyes, trying to hold herself together, but the emotions were overwhelming. She had to make a decision, but she wasn't ready. She wasn't sure if she would ever be ready. "I need time," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "I can't do this right now. Not like this." William's face fell, and for a brief moment, the weight of the years between them seemed to crash down on him. But then he nodded, slowly. "I'll wait. As long as it takes. Just don't shut me out again, Isabella. Please." Isabella stepped back, her heart torn between the man she had once loved and the life she had fought so hard to build without him. She turned away, but not without a lingering glance over her shoulder. William was still watching her, his eyes full of hope, of regret, and of a love that had never truly faded. And as she walked away from him, she couldn't shake the feeling that her heart was still tied to his, no matter how hard she tried to untangle it. Isabella stood there, staring at Duke William, his words hanging in the air like a fragile thread between them. "I never stopped loving you," he had said, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. The grand ballroom, the murmurs of the guests, the sparkling chandeliers above, all of it faded away as her heart raced, her mind trying to make sense of the words she had just heard. 10 years. 10 long years of pain, of exile, of trying to forget the man who had once meant everything to her. And now, here he was, standing before her, with those words. But what did they truly mean? How could they mean anything after all that had happened? Her hand trembled slightly as she clutched her fan, but she forced herself to breathe. She had to think. She had to respond. "You." Her voice faltered, the weight of the years catching in her throat. "You never stopped loving me?" The question sounded almost absurd in her own ears, yet it was all she could manage. William looked at her, his stormy blue eyes darkening with a mix of regret and longing. "Isabella," he began, his voice low and steady. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to let you go. But you were taken from me. My hands were tied, and He trailed off, his expression softening as if he were seeing her for the first time in years. Isabella swallowed hard, her heart aching as memories she had long buried rushed to the surface. She remembered the days before everything changed, how they had been so in love, so certain that nothing could tear them apart. But then, the scandal, the betrayal, her exile. "You let me go," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You chose duty over me, over us." William winced as if her words had struck him physically. "I never wanted to. I swear it. But my father, he forced my hand. And when you were taken away, I had no choice but to follow orders. You have to believe me, Isabella." The pain in his voice was raw, genuine. But how could she believe him now? How could she forget the years of heartache, the isolation, the fear that she had been forgotten? She had built a life in exile, learned to survive, learned to live without him. And yet, standing here now, she felt the flicker of the old emotions she had tried so hard to bury. "And what do you expect from me now?" Isabella asked, her voice barely a whisper. 10 years, William. 10 years of my life that I'll never get back. I've moved on. I had to. The words were like daggers, but she had to say them. She couldn't let him think that everything could just go back to how it was. He couldn't just waltz in and undo all the hurt, all the pain. William reached out, his hand hovering in the air, as if unsure whether to touch her. "Isabella," he said softly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I can never undo the damage I caused. But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped wanting you. And if you'll give me the chance, I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." She shook her head, the tears she had held back for so long threatening to spill over. "I don't know if I can believe that. I don't know if I can trust you again." The words felt like a betrayal to herself, but it was the truth. She had built walls around her heart, walls that had kept her safe all these years. And now, William Hawthorne was standing here, asking her to tear them down. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, give me a chance. I know I've hurt you, but I can't let you go again. I've waited 10 years for this moment, Isabella. Don't make me wait any longer." His plea was desperate, but it was too much. Too soon. She closed her eyes, trying to hold herself together, but the emotions were overwhelming. She had to make a decision, but she wasn't ready. She wasn't sure if she would ever be ready. "I need time," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "I can't do this right now. Not like this." William's face fell, and for a brief moment, the weight of the years between them seemed to crash down on him. But then he nodded, slowly. "I'll wait. As long as it takes. Just don't shut me out again, Isabella. Please." Isabella stepped back, her heart torn between the man she had once loved and the life she had fought so hard to build without him. She turned away, but not without a lingering glance over her shoulder. William was still watching her, his eyes full of hope, of regret, and of a love that had never truly faded. And as she walked away from him, she couldn't shake the feeling that her heart was still tied to his, no matter how hard she tried to untangle it. As the days passed at Grey Court Hall, Marian began to feel a strange sense of disquiet, one that clung to her like the winter fog outside. The Duke, Sebastian Hawks, remained an enigma, his icy exterior never once cracking, despite the subtle shifts in his behavior. His aloofness was something she had come to expect, yet there were moments, small, fleeting, when the walls around him seemed to tremble, as if some forgotten part of him longed to break free. Each morning, the fire would be lit in the library before she arrived, the scent of fresh flowers would appear on her side table, and the heavy curtains in her room would be drawn back just enough to let in the weak daylight. These gestures, though simple, felt like invitations. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being a mere guest in his home, someone who was tolerated out of necessity, not welcome. But despite the cold distance between them, Marian found herself oddly drawn to the melancholy beauty of the place. The mansion, though shrouded in grief, seemed to have a life of its own, a silent witness to both loss and resilience. The grand halls, the dark corridors lined with faded portraits, the east wing filled with dust-covered furniture, all of it seemed to hold memories, both good and bad, and the Duke seemed to carry the weight of them all. On the 4th day of her stay, Sebastian unexpectedly invited her to walk with him through the estate's gardens, a place she had longed to explore. The snow had finally ceased, leaving the ground crisp and white, with the promise of spring just beneath the surface. Marian, not wanting to seem too eager, accepted with a calm nod, though her heart raced in anticipation. As they strolled through the frost-covered paths, the silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. The Duke walked beside her, his gaze distant, but for the first time, there was a slight loosening of his posture, a subtle shift in his presence. The gardens, too, seemed to come alive under the morning sun, the delicate blooms struggling to peek through the remnants of the winter frost. It was a delicate balance, much like their conversation, one word away from the past, and the other towards a possible future. "You've done wonders with these gardens," Sebastian remarked, his voice low but carrying a weight that spoke volumes. Marian glanced at him, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you, Your Grace. The gardens have always been my sanctuary. Even in the darkest times, there is something beautiful about the way nature heals itself." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he studied the delicate roses, their petals still dusted with snow. "Nature does have a way of healing, doesn't it?" he murmured, almost to himself. "Perhaps it's not too late for us to find some healing as well." Marian felt a sudden rush of warmth, as if the air around them had shifted, though she wasn't sure if it was the change in the weather or the unspoken words hanging between them. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps the Duke wasn't as unreachable as she had once thought. They continued walking in silence, the sound of their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. It was a peaceful quiet, broken only by the distant call of birds returning from their migration. As they reached the far end of the garden, Marian stopped, turning to face him. "I don't know much about you, Your Grace," she said, her voice tentative. "Only the rumors and the whispers of the past." He raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. "The past is never as simple as people make it out to be," he finally said, his tone guarded. "Nor is it as easy to escape." There was a sadness in his eyes, a vulnerability that Marian hadn't expected to see. She didn't know what compelled her, but she reached out, gently placing her hand on his arm. "You don't have to face it alone, you know." His gaze flickered down to her hand, then back up to her face, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. There was a shift in the air, something palpable that hung between them like a fragile thread. But before Marian could speak again, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. A footman appeared, his expression hurried. "Your Grace, a message has arrived for you," he said, holding out an envelope. Sebastian nodded stiffly, his expression hardening once more as he took the letter. "Thank you, Edward," he said, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. As the footman retreated, Sebastian turned to Marian, his face now a mask of composure. "I'm afraid our conversation must be put on hold," he said quietly, his gaze no longer as soft as it had been moments ago. "There are matters that require my attention." Marian nodded, feeling the sudden shift in his mood, though she couldn't quite understand what had caused it. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, stepping back as he turned to leave. She watched him walk away, her heart heavy with a mix of confusion and longing. What had just happened? And why did it feel like something was beginning to change between them, despite the walls he had built around himself? As she turned to head back inside, the weight of the moment lingered in the cold air. The storm had passed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than the weather was about to arrive at Greycourt Hall. The following morning, Marian woke to the soft sound of wind against the windows, the storm now nothing but a distant memory. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of the Duke, his coldness, his warmth, the fleeting connection they had shared in the garden. She couldn't help but wonder if it had all been a figment of her imagination. Had he truly softened, even just for a moment, or was it only her own longing that had made her see what she wanted to see? As she made her way downstairs for breakfast, she found the house as quiet as ever, the servants moving like shadows through the halls. It felt as though time had paused inside the walls of Greycourt Hall, a place frozen in its own grief, its own silence. The Duke, Sebastian Hawks, had retreated back into his solitude, his brief moments of openness locked away once again behind his icy demeanor. Marian had learned over the past few days that his company was both a balm and a wound. He was kind, in his way, yet distant, always keeping her at arm's length, never allowing the slightest breach in his armor. She couldn't decide if it was pity or something else that kept her longing to understand him, to break through the walls he had built around himself. After breakfast, She found herself wandering the estate's gardens once again, though this time, the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath the thawing frost. The air smelled fresh, invigorating, and for a moment, Marian allowed herself to forget the complexities of the household, the Duke, and the quiet tension that had settled between them. She knelt by a rose bush, her fingers carefully tending to the delicate petals, when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She stood, turning just as the Duke appeared, walking with purpose toward her. He was dressed in his usual dark attire, his posture rigid, but there was something different about him today, something softer in the way his eyes met hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with unspoken words. "You're here early," Marian said, her voice tentative, breaking the silence. Sebastian's lips quirked ever so slightly. "I find the mornings easier to bear," he replied, his voice low, almost as though he were sharing something deeply personal. Marian nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was a vulnerability in his words, in his presence, that she had never noticed before. It made him seem less like the Duke, less like the cold figure who had been hiding behind his grief, and more like a man who had been silently yearning for something he didn't know how to reach. She started, but the words faltered on her lips. "It's all right," he said, taking a step closer, his gaze shifting to the rose bush she had been tending to. "You're good with them, with the flowers." Marian blinked in surprise. "Thank you. I find peace in them." There was a pause before he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Peace is a rare commodity around here, isn't it?" Marian hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. "It can be. But there are moments, fleeting ones, when it feels possible." His gaze lingered on her face, as though searching for something in her expression. "I don't think I've ever really known peace," he said quietly. The confession hung in the air between them, a weight neither of them could ignore. "You don't have to be alone in that," Marian found herself saying before she could stop herself. She immediately regretted the words, but to her surprise, the Duke didn't retreat. Instead, he looked at her, his expression softening, his eyes searching hers as though seeing her for the first time. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marian took a step closer, her heart racing, her hands trembling. "I mean that you don't have to carry all of this alone. The pain, the grief, whatever it is you're holding on to. You don't have to bear it by yourself." She realized, as soon as the words left her mouth, how much she meant them. She had always known loss, always been a witness to the quiet suffering of others, but she had never felt the way she did in that moment, standing in front of this man who had been so closed off, so guarded, yet still somehow yearning for something. Sebastian stared at her for a long moment, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite read. "And what do you want from me, Marian?" he asked, his tone guarded but tinged with a vulnerability that sent a shiver down her spine. She shook her head slightly. "I don't want anything," she said softly. "I just want to offer what I can. I want you to know that there's still room for something more than pain, if you'll allow it." For the first time since she had arrived at Grey Court Hall, Sebastian seemed at a loss for words. His eyes dropped to the ground, and for a moment, he looked as if he were struggling with something inside himself. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze back to hers, and in the depths of his eyes, Marian saw something she hadn't expected: hope. The realization hit her like a wave. There was a part of him, buried deep beneath the layers of grief and pride, that still longed for something, someone, to help him find his way back from the darkness. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Marian nodded, unsure of what to say next. She wasn't sure where they stood now, or what might come next between them, but in that moment, she felt a connection, fragile but undeniable. The storm had passed, and the sun, though still weak, had finally begun to break through the clouds. The following morning, Marian awoke with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years, the weight of the storm that had passed lifting from her heart. The garden outside her window was now bathed in soft sunlight, the snow melting away to reveal the first signs of spring, just as the tension between her and the Duke seemed to thaw. Sebastian had been distant since their conversation in the garden, retreating back into his silent world, but Marian couldn't help but feel a subtle shift between them. She had seen something in him, something raw and vulnerable that he hadn't shown anyone in years, perhaps not even himself. She didn't know what it meant, or where it would lead, but for the first time since she'd arrived at Grey Court Hall, she felt a quiet hope stirring in her chest. As the day passed, she went about her usual routine, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the Duke, to the small, fleeting moments they had shared, to the softening in his gaze when he looked at her. It was a warmth she couldn't quite explain, but one that made her heart race with the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than the grief-stricken man he appeared to be. In the late afternoon, as she made her way through the house, she ran into him unexpectedly in the hallway. His figure loomed at the far end, his back to her as he spoke with a servant. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of how to approach him, unsure of what to say. She had never been one for grand gestures, but something inside her urged her to step forward, to break the silence that had fallen between them. She took a deep breath and moved toward him, her footsteps soft against the old stone floor. As she approached, he turned, his piercing gray eyes locking with hers. "Miss Blythe," he said, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Marian hesitated for a heartbeat, then smiled, a small but genuine gesture. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. There was a long pause as they simply stood there, each of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. The silence stretched between them, but this time, it felt different, like the space was no longer filled with tension or distance, but with something softer, something more tentative. Finally, Sebastian spoke, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday." Marian's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "For what, Your Grace?" she asked softly. "For offering something I didn't know I needed," he said, his words slow and measured, as if he were choosing them carefully. "It's been a long time since anyone has reached out to me like that." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Marian felt her heart skip a beat. She had only spoken from the heart, unsure of what she was doing, but somehow, it seemed that her words had cut through the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly, stepping closer, her gaze never leaving his. "I just wanted you to know that you don't have to carry everything alone." His eyes softened, his usual impassive mask slipping just a fraction. "I know," he said quietly. "It's just," his voice trailed off, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as though he were fighting with himself. Marian wanted to reach out, to say something to comfort him, but she wasn't sure if the words would be enough. She settled for simply standing there, offering him the quiet presence she had come to realize he needed. Sebastian finally looked at her, his gaze meeting hers with a depth she hadn't expected. "I've never been good at this," he admitted, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that surprised her. "At letting people in." Marian nodded, understanding more than he realized. "It's not easy," she said softly. "But sometimes, it's the only way to heal." There was a long pause as he seemed to absorb her words. Then, as if making a decision, he gave a small nod. "Perhaps you're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps it's time to stop hiding." Marian's heart fluttered in her chest, the weight of his words settling over her like a promise. She didn't know what the future held, or how things would change between them, but in that moment, something shifted between them, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Before she could say anything else, a voice interrupted them. A servant appeared at the far end of the hall, calling out to the Duke. Sebastian turned toward the sound, his expression hardening once again. "I must attend to this," he said, his tone returning to its usual cool detachment. Marian nodded, stepping back. "Of course, Your Grace." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning away, his figure disappearing down the hallway. Marian stood there for a moment, her heart still racing, her mind spinning with the conversation they had just shared. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had made a difference, even if just for a fleeting moment. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the Duke's figure in the distance, and for the first time, she didn't see him as a distant, untouchable figure. She saw him as a man, one who had been buried under grief for far too long, but who was finally starting to emerge from the shadows. Days passed, and a subtle shift seemed to settle over Grey Court Hall. The air, once thick with grief and silence, now felt charged with an unspoken understanding, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. Marian went about her duties as usual, tending to the gardens, managing her lessons with the few staff members she interacted with, but her mind often wandered back to the Duke, to Sebastian. Their brief conversation in the hallway, where he had opened up in ways she had never expected, lingered in her thoughts like a quiet promise. But Sebastian, though his walls had cracked ever so slightly, still kept his distance. He remained the Duke, distant and aloof, retreating to his solitude when their paths would cross. Marian could sense the struggle in him, the battle between wanting to let go of the past and the weight of the duty that held him captive. It was a fight she knew all too well, for her own past had shaped her in ways she could never fully escape. Still, there was something in the way he looked at her now, something that made her wonder if he was beginning to see her not just as a servant, but as a person, as someone who had quietly and steadily been there for him in ways no one else had. That thought, that quiet hope, warmed her even on the coldest mornings. One afternoon, after finishing her work in the library, Marian wandered toward the gardens once more, drawn to the stillness of the flowers and the promise of spring that was just beginning to unfold. The day had been clouded with heavy rain, but as she stepped outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the damp earth. She breathed in deeply, the fresh air filling her lungs as she knelt by a bed of freshly bloomed tulips. Her hands moved instinctively, the familiar task of tending to the flowers grounding her. As she worked, she felt a presence behind her, and before she could turn around, a voice broke the silence. "Miss Blythe." Sebastian's voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made her heart skip a beat. She looked up to find him standing just a few feet away, his posture as rigid as ever, but there was something different in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to still, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. Marian blinked in surprise. "Apologize? For what?" "Your Grace," she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away as if gathering his thoughts. "For the way I've been," he began, his voice tinged with regret. "For the distance I've kept. I know you've been nothing but kind to me, and yet His words trailed off, and for a brief moment, Marian saw the vulnerability in him she had never thought possible. "You don't have to apologize," she said quietly, standing up and brushing the dirt from her hands. "I understand more than you think." He met her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers as though trying to find something, an answer, perhaps, or a glimpse of hope. "I don't know how to let anyone in, Marian," he said, his voice strained. "I've spent so long locked in this house, in my grief, in my duty, that I've forgotten how to feel, how to connect." Marian's heart ached for him, for the man who had buried himself in his own pain for so long. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself," she said softly, taking a small step closer. "You don't have to be alone in this." For a long moment, Sebastian simply stared at her, as if the weight of her words were too much for him to comprehend. Then, slowly, he closed the distance between them, his hand reaching out as if drawn by some invisible force. Marian held her breath as his fingers brushed lightly against hers, a touch so gentle it felt like the world was shifting around them. "I've never known what it's like to have someone care," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Not like this." Marian's heart fluttered, her own emotions swirling inside her. She had never expected this, never imagined that the Duke of Grey Court, a man so lost in his own grief, would find solace in her simple kindness. "I care," she said, her voice steady, but her pulse racing in her veins. "I always have." He looked down at their hands, still touching, and for a brief moment, the walls between them seemed to crumble. Then, with a quiet sigh, he pulled back, his expression once again unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone distant once more. "I need to return to my duties." Marian nodded, her heart heavy, but she knew better than to press him. "Of course, Your Grace." As he turned to walk away, Marian stood there, her hand still tingling where his fingers had touched hers. She had hoped for a moment of connection, a moment of understanding, but as always, Sebastian remained a man of duty, of distance. Still, something had shifted. She could feel it. The storm inside him wasn't over, but perhaps, just perhaps, There was a crack in the wall he had built so carefully around his heart. As she watched him disappear back into the mansion, Marian couldn't help but wonder if the day would come when he would finally let go of his past, when he would finally see her for who she truly was, not as a servant, but as someone who had quietly, patiently, been waiting for him to find his way back to the light. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, tentative routine. The storm had passed, but the atmosphere in Grey Court Hall remained charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marian continued her work with the same grace and diligence as always, but her mind often wandered back to the Duke, to Sebastian. He had retreated back into his solitude, as if his brief moment of vulnerability had been a fleeting aberration. Still, Marian couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Despite his distance, there were moments, small, but significant, when their eyes would meet across a room, and in that instant, she could see the faintest flicker of something in his gaze. It was as if he were silently reaching out to her, unsure whether he should take the next step. One afternoon, Marian found herself in the library, her fingers running over the spines of the books that lined the shelves, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Sebastian standing in the doorway, his usual impassive expression softened by a hint of uncertainty. "Miss Blythe," he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual coldness. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Marian felt her heart skip a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, though she wasn't sure what to expect. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, setting the book she had been holding back on the shelf. "What is it?" Sebastian hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, his gaze flickering to the window, as if seeking the right words. "I realize that I've been distant," he began, his voice low. "I know I've kept you at arm's length, and I want to apologize for that." Marian felt a rush of emotion, her chest tightening as he spoke. She hadn't expected an apology, but here it was, offered in the quietest of tones. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly, her voice steady. "I understand more than you think." He looked at her then, his gray eyes searching her face, and for the first time, she saw something in them that wasn't just sorrow or distance. It was something warmer, more personal. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "And I didn't know how to let anyone in. I've spent so long hiding behind my grief, behind my responsibilities, that I forgot what it meant to be human, to connect with others." Marian felt her heart break for him. The walls he had built so high that even he had forgotten how to tear them down. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said quietly, stepping closer to him. "There's still room for healing, if you're willing to let it in." For a moment, Sebastian stood frozen, his eyes fixed on hers as if seeing her for the first time. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of tension that comes before something monumental, before a change, before the possibility of something new. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to try, Marian. I want to try to let go of the past, to stop living in the shadow of what I've lost. But I don't know if I'm capable of it." Marian reached out, her hand brushing his gently, a quiet reassurance. "You don't have to do it alone," she repeated softly. "I'm here." He looked down at their hands, his fingers trembling slightly as they lingered in the space between them. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me." Marian's heart fluttered, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at him. The walls he had built were still there, but they were beginning to crack, beginning to crumble. And for the first time, she felt that there was a chance for something more between them. Something real. Slowly, tentatively, Sebastian took a step closer, closing the distance between them. His hand reached up to touch her cheek, his fingers trembling as they brushed against her skin. Marian closed her eyes at the warmth of his touch, her heart racing in her chest. For a moment, everything else faded away, the house, the world, the past, and it was just the two of them, standing together in this fragile moment of connection. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, his breath warm against her skin, "but I know that I don't want to face it alone." Marian's eyes opened, and she met his gaze, seeing something there that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just sorrow or grief anymore. It was hope, a small but steady flame of hope. "You don't have to," she whispered. "You don't have to face it alone." And in that moment, as the sun streamed through the windows of Grey Court Hall, Marian realized that this was the beginning of something new, something fragile but full of promise. The storm inside Sebastian had not passed, but it was no longer a storm that would drown him. It was a storm that would, in time, be weathered. And perhaps, together, they could find their way through it. With a quiet sigh, he leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss full of uncertainty, full of possibility. But as they pulled back, their eyes met, and Marian knew, without a doubt, that the journey ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. And neither was he.